Hello folks, this is Leah Bonasake from Master Lab Systems. So today we'll be looking at implementing hexagonal architecture with the Java Springboot for building clean microservices. Okay? Let's look at the problem scenario that we have. Why would we really require to use hexagonal architecture over the traditional layered architecture? Okay? For example, a request will come through a controller, goes to a service, a repository, pattern works until the system grows, of course. However, there are quite some challenges. There's a tight coupling between layers. It's also hard to replace database or frameworks, and it is difficult to test core business logic without having to interfere with it. Also, the code quickly becomes too messy in microservices. Of course, you can expect in a microservices environment when you have too much of controller services in the repositories, it becomes too much to even memorize which one you have touched, especially when you are, for example, doing some unit testing. So it becomes too messy in microservices. Okay, let's look at the solution using hexagonal architecture now. Hexagonal architecture is also known as ports and adapters architecture because it works in a manner of ports and adapters. Also, it focuses primarily on core domain business logic. And external systems are known as DBs, APIs, UIs. They become adapters, which eventually they could easily be switchable, meaning you can just simply plug a new adapter if you want to change a DB connection, or if you want to change an API connection or a UI instance. You can simply just plug a new adapter. Lastly, the domain never depends on external systems, which makes sense in an hexagonal architecture because of the domain is always kept separated with external systems. Okay, let's look at the architectural diagram for hexagonal. So for example, inside the hexagonal there are entities, business logic, which are known as use cases, and ports are known as interfaces that define how the domain interacts with the outside world. Adapters, implementations, which are known as REST controllers, database repositories, message brokers, etc. Those are known as adapters. Let's look at the core domain principles. Domain is independent of frameworks. Use interface ports for inbound and outbound communications. Adapters implement the ports. Easy to replace external systems without touching the core domain layer. Let's look at the project structure for the system that will be implemented, which is a book service. So a book service would contain a domain that contains the packages of a model and ports and service. So a model would contain a model, which is a book structure for our application for a normal model. A port would mean we are having a book repository for DB and a book service, which is also an interface that is implemented in the service package under the book service API. Lastly, looking at the adapters, we have an inbound adapter, which is a controller, and an outbound, which is a DB connection, known as HAPA repository. Okay, now let's look at the benefits of using hexagonal architecture in our applications. Firstly, maintainability, clean separation of concerns, flexibility, swap databases, frameworks, and UIs easily. Testability, mock parts for unit testing. Scalability, also it is also perfect for microservices. Okay, let's now look at the real world use cases. Microservices, for example, a payment system, payment, orders, catalog. So systems with multiple data sources, so which makes very much useful for using this architecture in systems that contain or that have multiple data sources that you can just simply plug and play using adapters. Applications that evolve over time, for example, start with Postgres, later migrate to MongoDB, later Elasticsearch, makes it easily to just simply do that without touching the core domain layer. Okay, now folks, let's look at how we can implement this hexagonal architecture in our Java Springboot application. So first of all, I would love us to start if we can create a simple project using Spring Initializer. I normally have a Spring Initializer in my browser tab. bookmarked. So if you don't have it, you can simply type start.spring.io. It will take you to this initial page for Spring Initializer. Okay, so now let's select the language. We'll leave it to Java. Build tool, we'll keep it Maven. Spring Boot version 3.5.5, that's fine. Now let's change the metadata. So com.masterlab, I'm just going to put it masterlab here and then say demo. Okay, artifact, maybe let's say here hexagonal. Okay, and the project is going to be hexagonal. So here it's fine. Spring Boot, you can just leave it like that or put it the different descriptive name or descriptive description. Okay, it's fine. As you can see, the package name is going to be com.masterlab.hexagonal. Fine. Packaging, we keep it to Java, and Java version, it's fine, we can use 17. So once we have all of these folks in, now we can begin to add our dependencies. So the stuff that we'll need, of course, dev tools. So we'll require dev tools, Lomog for reducing boilerplate code, though you don't really need this one, but it's essential to have it. So let's get the h2 db now for persisting. Okay, let's get that one in. So I think these are the only ones okay, web, let's not forget, since we are building a web application, Springboot web, those are the core ones that we require. So once we have all of these folks in, you can simply generate, which I will do now. But of course, once you have done this, you will simply import it to your own IDE, of which what we'll be looking. So now our application has been generated successfully, so now we need to import it to our IDE. Okay, so I have already done this process, imported it, so I will just show you in case you really need to, of course, start a new project from scratch or build on top of your existing Java Springboot applications, which also depending on your scenario or your use case. So now, folks, let's go ahead and start implementing this. So in my IDE, this is the project that I've already imported. As you can see, hexagonal, it has already been imported. This is the structure that you get, which is the default structure that you will get when you have recently generated your Spring Boot project from Spring Initializer. So this is the basic structure that you will get, of course, with your resources file in for your configuration and your main class for execution. Okay, so now, as I said, that now we'll use our hexagonal architecture. So first, I'm just going to bring out that string again, just in case we have forgotten the structure. So again, using our application, we have this structure that says adapters and domain. So now let's go ahead first and create the initial packages for adapters and domain. So now if I come in here, Java, okay, say now let's create what? The first package called adapters. Okay, we've created adapters. So now let's create now the domain package. Domain, we have created adapters and domain. So now in adapters we'll have inbound and outbound, but we can also confirm that. So adapters will have inbound and outbound. Let's go ahead and create the second packages. So in package inbound and outbound. So now let's create the second one. So ensure you are still in adapters. So outbound for our DB connections, outbound. Okay, so now once we have all of those in, we have inbound and outbound. So now once we have all of this in, so let's go to domain again. So in domain, we require what? Bots, models, and services. Okay, so let's go ahead, folks, and create those. So in domain, we require what? Bots and models. So let's start with domain models. Let's save that in model. Probably put it to model. Okay, let's find models. It's fine. Just gonna put the singular domain models. So let's have now bots package 2, which is bots. Let's get bots and services. which is the third package called services. Okay, so now our hexagonal structure now is complete. So we need to start adding some code now, some files. Okay, so now once we have this structure, we know now that in adapters we have an inbound and outbound. An inbound would mean it's a controller because of a request would come through an inbound, and of course the external one, that would mean it's a DB connection where there is a JPA repository. Okay, so now that folks, we have all of this in place, we can start implementing our code. So first of all, I will start adding our back config. So let's first verify all our dependencies if are in place before we add a new code. Okay, of course, as I said, we require a DB to persist. So now we have our DB connection, which is the H2. We have our dev tools dependencies. We have our starter web, which is the dependency that we require, and the rest we have our JPA for establishing connection to our DB, which is the JPA, and Lombok to reduce boilerplate code. Okay, those are the dependencies that we require. So meaning now we are good to go once we have these dependencies in place. Okay, so secondly, now we need to create a connection now to our DB, which is through a resource file. Let's go now and add our DB connection. Okay, so already in Spring, it comes by default with this one liner when you have recently generated a project. However, in this case, I'm just gonna copy from my config, as I have some snippets in place for this process. So now I'll explain this. Of course, we need to define the data source URL, JDB. So you can see H2, which is the in-memory DB, it goes to mem, and the book DB, which is the database name for our DB. So data source, driver class, of course, org H2, because H2 DB, the driver username, I'm putting I'm giving it that, and password empty. And of course, it's important to specify the JPA so it knows that it's a UH2. It can just auto-dilect our queries. And of course, the console is enabled so we can see when the queries are being processed or executed. Okay, of course, it's important it does the auto update of our DDR. Okay, so now that we have all of that in place, we can begin to add our code. Okay, so first things first, let's start on the inbound. So we know here we have a book controller that we need to be having. So a book controller to Java. Let's first create that file. Okay, so it's fine if I just said, so create a new Java class book controller. Oh my bad, made a mistake there. Okay, so let's see, create with book controller. Okay, now that we have that in here, book controller. So here, which is the second file that we require now, it's a JPA book repo. So JPA book repository. Okay, let's just copy that in here as well. JPA book repo, and copy that in. So of course, folks, if you require the code, you can simply message or just comment on this video. Once I made an upload, I will forward the code. I will push it to my GitHub account. Okay, now let's have that JPA repository in place as well under outbound. So of course, as I said, I've got some snippets in place already for this demo, so I'm just gonna copy from those. So again, we start with a controller, but of course I'll explain the code. I'll explain the code once as I add these classes. So of course, as I said, the package is gonna be there, book controller. So from here, let's simply now go fix our errors. Of course, it's gonna complain now because we still don't have much of our files. So let's add that. Okay, for now we'll keep it as this, like this. Maybe we need to start adding from bare to up, so we can avoid having these errors. Okay, because maybe you might wanna know where I'm deriving from this code, so I'm just gonna start so we don't have any errors. Okay, so the first step we need is to add a model. So a model would mean it's a book. It's a book model. So let's add that model, because a model is a bare minimum that you require. So I'm just going to check from one of my snippets the model. Okay, I already have it. So let's copy this model. So this is basically a poacher model, which is a plain old Java object model that contains getters and setters to string, constructors, default, and argumented constructor. Okay. So now that we have that in place, let's look at what we need now. Okay, so now we are done with the book model. So we can close that in. So now what else do we need? It's boards. So as I said, on the boards we have what? Well, we can, on the boards we have what? Which we will be looking at that in a minute. So of course, start with the domain. On the domain we add a model. We are done with the model. Done. From adding that, let's move to boards now. So here we have, of course, our interfaces. So which is now what? The book service. As I said, we can just refer to our structure again. So on the boards we have what? A book repository. That is an interface. Of course, that will be implemented from the JPA repository. Okay, and a book service, which is also an interface that is implemented under the service, which is by the book service MPL. Okay, so from the book repository now on port, let's go create that. So which is this one, book repository. Of course, once we add the code, it will change to an interface. So again, now let's also add this book service before we go back to the adapters. Okay, book service, we have now on the boards book service. Add that in. So now let's add the implementation for those. Okay, maybe lastly on the service we can add our book service IMPL. Of course, it will be implemented. So on the services, let's add now our book service IMPL, which implements what? Our driving board. Okay, we have that in. So now we can start to add our code. So of course, this would mean it's a service. So now let's first add the interface that implements that. So again, we have the book service. This is going to be our book service. Let's copy that and paste it in. So book service, which is an interface that gets implemented by the book service IMPL. Okay, let's just simply remove that. Okay, so it requires what? Models. Okay, so now that we have that, so of course, as I said, I will explain the code as I go through. So we have an interface class of a book service that contains two functionalities, well, three, which is the book, the add book to add a new book, and an optional book, which is if you want to filter by an ID of a book to return that. As I said, get by an ID to get a book by an ID, and also lastly, which is the apply discount. If you want to apply a certain percentage of a discount to a certain book, then you can also be able to do that. Okay, so now that we have the book service in place, we need now to have an implementation of that book service. Okay, let's go ahead from our snippet again. So this is the book service now, which is what I'm just gonna copy it from that. And as I said, if you require the code, I'll simply push it to my GitHub account. Okay, so now let's add now the book service implementation. Okay, of course it will complete now. So of course let's fix that. Okay, let's fix the reference to models. Okay, of course it will complain because of we don't have a book repository yet, which is what we will be adding now. I will also explain this code. Okay, let's go ahead and add that one now, the book repository. Okay, so if we go to that now, let's simply add the book repository, which is also an interface. So let me just remove this in here. You can see models. Of course, let's fix the import. So now this is how it looks like now, the book repository. As I said, on the board we have two files, which is the book repository, that is an interface, and a book service, which is also an interface that gets implemented on the service by the book service API. Okay, so looking at the book repository now, I have two functionalities, which is the save of a new book and the find by an ID of an existing book, right? So of course now we have now the interface, which is a book service, that have these three functionalities, which is the apply discount, get book by an ID, which takes a parameter of a string ID, and an actual book, which is to add a new book, which takes what, an instance of a what, or an object of a book, and adds that to the book object. Okay, now we are implementing the books now. So as you can see now, automatically now that the reference is already in place, the errors have disappeared. Okay, so now again I'm just gonna explain this code again. So of course we're creating an instance of what, of a book repository, and we do what, a constructor. So here I can also do an auto wire to ensure that we are doing what, a constructor injection at auto wired. So let's add that in, so which takes a parameter of a what, a constructor of a book repository, and assigns that in. So as you can see now, we are overriding what, our interface class, which is our book service, by calling those existing functions that we defined in, and we are overriding those in, which is we're implementing them. So of course we have a book instance that takes a book of an object and appends to a book and saves that to a repository. And then same goes for filtering by an ID of an existing book, okay, and applying a discount of an existing book, a certain percentage of his existing book. Okay, so once we have all of that in, folks, so now we need to go back now to our adapters so we can finalize that. Okay, so now we have all of this code in place. Models is in, ports are in, and services in. Okay, so now let's go back to our adapters. Okay, let's look at now the two, which is the inbound and outbound. Okay, so of course, as you can see, we are still following our application structure, which I also showed on my presentation. Okay, so now let's add the two remaining classes now. Okay, that should be okay. Let's start with this one here. Okay, so now if we come back to our outbound, so now we need to add our DB connection. Okay, so now I'm just gonna copy and paste it, so we don't have a same duplicate. Okay, models, let's add it to models. Okay, so this is basically the structure that we require because of the JPA repository extends what, our book repo, and the JPA repository, which is from what, which is from Spring. So that takes what, a parameter of a book object and a string, since our ID is a long and it's a string. Okay, so once we have that in, that's fine. Now we can implement our controller now. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy that snippet of a controller Okay, so we can copy this one now. Okay, let's copy that in for the controller. Okay, so if I come back to and paste this in here, folks. Okay, now let's fix out the errors, which is the remaining ones. Okay, I'm just gonna remove this. Okay, so of course models. So now that should fix our issues. Okay, so of course I'll explain the code again. So looking at this is the basic controller class for any Java Spring Boot application that is defined by the REST controller. Of course, the mapping will go to the books parameter. Okay, so now same thing that we are doing here, we are creating an instance of a book service and an instance of a book service, which is that, and we are creating a constructor that takes what an instance of that book service and appends to that. So the first function that we have, which is a post, it's adding what a new book. So of course it requires what a book in instance of a book object and gets that and goes to book service to add that book, which is the one that we are getting from the user input. Okay, looking at endpoint number 2, which is now this get by an ID. So basically this one we are getting a book by an ID, so it takes a long value or a history of an ID, which is an existing ID, and filter that by that ID and returns to you, or else if it fails if the book does not exist. So looking at the last endpoint now, which takes a parameter of what an ID of an existing ID book and the certain percentage amount that you want to supply, and it does that, which is it applies this discount based on my calculation of that applied discount. So basically that's what it does. But of course we are not really interested in the functionality of the code, but rather the architecture itself. Okay, so I think folks that is it. Now we can start to test the code to run the project and start to test from our postman. Okay, so now if I run our application, let's go back to our main class or our main entry point of execution. So now if I run this application, it should start out fine. Let's see. Okay, just give it a second. It's building. Okay, let's do that. Let's showcase it while it's building. Okay, it's running that, bootstrapping our DB connections. So it's starting our application. Okay, let's give it a second, folks. As you can see, it's initializing our DB connection, bootstrapping our entities. As you can see, database version. Okay, so seems to have started successfully, folks. Okay, so as you can see now, it is started on port 8080, so we can begin to start our testing. So if now we go to our postman, so for example, I had supplied the basic book, but of course I'll start from scratch. So now instead of using my existing test before, so I will just say Java cleancode as a new book that we're adding. So now let's give this book a price of 500. Okay, so let's send, as you can see, it's going there, 80 books, which is at this endpoint. So as you can see, it's going to this endpoint, which is to add a new book. This one to add a new book. Books goes to that endpoint. As you can see, there's no other definition. Okay, so now if we go back books, and then we are passing our parameters. Okay, now if we can send this request, as you can see, folks, the status code, it's 200. It means the request was successfully sent and we are getting back an ID of our book, Java cleancode. So as you can see, it means this book was successfully saved from our DB. So now if I do this one, for instance, if I try to copy this book and we want to filter with it, of course, maybe let me first add one more we can filter with this book. For now, if for instance I were to copy this and use my second request, which takes what, an ID of a book, and if you want to filter by that. So now if we paste this now, let's say we should be returning that book that we created with a price of 500. As you can see, folks, we are getting it back, so meaning the functionality is working successfully fine. So we can still test it by adding one more book. So let's say now Hexagonal Architecture. Let's see, architecture, oh my bad, let's say just IK, it's fine, hexagonal IK. So let's put it on 500. So now let's send this request. Let's create another new book. As you can see, folks, it has successfully been saved and we are getting back an ID. So we can be able to filter by this ID to return back our book. So we can do that to test again our filtering. So if now I pass this to provide that ID in, so we should be getting back our book. As you can see, folks, successfully, it's working 100% fine. So now I will be ending here, folks. So if you have any questions or comments, please, if you really need the code, I'll just message or comment on the section, on the comment section, then I'll answer that. Okay, so without wasting, let me just finalize my presentation first. So now lastly, if we look at the summary that we did, so again, traditional layered architecture becomes missed, as I said, in microservices, which makes sense because right now, for example, if you wanted to implement a new DB connection, you would simply change what? An adapter. Simple. You still keep your business logic. This is why you'll probably be doing an adapter, changing a GPA repository. That's probably that you will have to change if you have a new DB connection or you want to connect to an API for that matter. Okay. The rest of the domain layer is still kept the same. Nothing has changed on it. That's the advantages of using the hexagonal architecture. Again, hexagonal architecture, which is known as ports and adapters, it keeps the code very cleaner, and domain is independent, testable, and scalable. And lastly, Spring Boot makes it straightforward to implement it. Okay? So folks, I will be ending here today. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel, and if you need the code, you have any comment, please comment on the comment section below and I will be answering those. Thank you folks for listening. Thank you so much. Cheers. See you in the next episode. Cheers. Bye. Peace.